We have an amazing night for you guys. This is the final Socratic stage of the year, and it could not be better. We just had a brief conversation with our two distinguished guests, and we obviously ran over a little bit because it was just fascinating and riveting, and the stories are just beyond belief. So you're going to be treated to something special. I'd be remiss if I didn't say thanks again to Ling and Michael Markovitz, who are down in front. They have generously helped fund all of our Socratic stages. And as you can see, the lineup that we had this year going into next year, it's second to none in the entire state university system. So thank you, Ling and Michael. I'll introduce our two guests, but they equally both do not need introduction. Obviously, immediately to my right is Professor Alan Dershowitz. He has been called... He's been called the world's best known lawyer. I take offense to that, I'm a pretty good lawyer. And its most prominent defender of civil liberties. He has litigated and won hundreds of cases in multiple countries. He has received numerous honorary degrees, medals, and honors. One such honor was bestowed upon him by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel, who said, if there had been a few people like Alan Dershowitz during the 1930s and the 1940s, the history of European Jewry might have been different, which is super powerful. A lot of his cases and cause have been pro bono, including defense of dissidents worldwide from Anatoly Sharansky, Václav Havel, and Julian Assange. Professor Dershowitz graduated first in his class from Yale Law School and was the editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Review, or Law Journal. He taught at Harvard for 50 years with his primary academic interest being on the prediction and prevention of harmful conduct. Professor Dershowitz has been teaching, writing, and litigating about law and policy for more than 50 years. He has written 55 books, more than 1,000 articles, and many of today's leaders around the world are among the 10,000 students he has taught. He has represented and advised presidents, prime ministers, and business leaders. At the age of 86, he continues to write and consult while spending more time with his wife, Carolyn, who is with us here today. They've been married 39 years, 3 children, and 2 grandchildren. Please welcome Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you. It's a great honor. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Stephen Donziger is a lawyer and environmental activist who has been the target of an oil company revenge campaign for over 30 years. In 2013, Stephen helped Amazon communities in Ecuador win the largest environmental judgment in history when a court ordered Chevron to pay $9.5 billion, $12 billion today, to restore ancestral lands despoiled by the dumping of billions of gallons of cancer-causing waste into the waterways. In retaliation, Chevron used its political and financial capital to countersue Stephen for contempt of court, strip him of his law license, and detain him at home in prison for close to 3 years. While Stephen continues to battle against Chevron, he also advocates for other victims of corporate malfeasance and offers legal interpretations of human rights issues. And with that introduction of both, we'll please welcome Stephen too. And with that, please enjoy what will be nothing short of an amazing conversation between 2 brilliant minds on justice or politics, the weaponization of law in modern America. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I have been so looking forward. This is working.
It should be on.
Hi, is it working? Yeah. Been so looking forward to learning about this great university, and I'm so happy to be seated, as I said before, between 2 of my heroes. Steve graduated Harvard Law School, has been a hero to the legal community for generations as he's fought corporate greed and judicial improprieties, and I'm so happy to always have been a supporter. And the new college and its president have been real heroes in the fight for academic diversity, real diversity, and entering the new college into the marketplace of ideas among universities. And so I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation and discussion. We're talking about lawfare and weaponization, and I have to start with a name-dropping story. Okay. So my wife and I are in Mar-a-Lago, and we are there between the time President Trump is elected and the time he's inaugurated, and I'm there to speak at an event on lawfare involving the beginning involving a man who had been victimized by lawfare. And so the president found out that we were there for that, and he called me in, and he said, "What are you here for?" And we had a little talk. I told him I was giving a speech about lawfare. He said, "Oh, I'm going to come." So he came to the speech, and I talked a lot about lawfare, and it's in the film. And then I ended by talking directly to President Trump. And I said, "Look, you're here, thank you. And I have a very important message, please. What they did to you in terms of lawfare is absolutely intolerable and unacceptable. Your trial in New York, your trials in New York, but particularly your trial in New York for paying hush money, is the worst criminal case I've seen in 60 years of practice. But please, 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 when you become president, when the Republicans take over, don't try to get even. Don't use lawfare, don't use weaponization as a counter weapon. The best response to weaponization and to lawfare is neutrality on all sides. Don't do what Lavrenti Beria, the head of the KGB, did when he went to Stalin during the horrible times of the 1930s, and he said to Stalin, "Show me the man, and I'll find you the crime." And that's the way Soviet injustice operated. And that's the way democratic injustice in New York operated under Letitia James, the Attorney General, and Alvin Bragg, the District Attorney. They both ran for office on the promise to get Trump. And they tried to search hard to find crimes and civil liability, and they couldn't. So they had to make it up. And that's what they did. They just made it up. And there's this great temptation when you've been victimized, as you have been victimized, I have been victimized by false accusations, by false charges. There's always the temptation to get even by doing to them what they did to us. And that's what creates the kind of tit-for-tat circular misuse of weaponization. And it's so important to cut that and to make sure that it doesn't apply on either side. I'm going to make the same exact point in my brief introduction, and then we'll talk to each other, but I'm going to make the same point about universities. The new college, in some respects, under its wonderful president, is in some respects a reaction to the old college and to old colleges generally around the country. Colleges and universities have become bastions of left-wing, progressive politics. Teachers are not teaching students how to think, they're teaching them what to think. I can say that in 60 years of association with Harvard Law School, you were there, I never once expressed a personal view in the classroom. Never once. My students would always come up to me after class, but what do you think? Because, you know, in my class, there was no such thing as a right answer. Every answer begot a question and another question and another question of the Socratic method. So I would always say, I'm not paid to tell you what I think. I'm paid to teach you how to think better. If you're a conservative, I want you to be a smarter conservative. If you're a liberal, I want you to be a much more intelligent liberal. That's what I want. And we saw over the past probably couple of decades, certainly since the Vietnam War, but it became more extreme in recent years, the politicization of American universities. Virtually every professor today is on the left. And they believe, many of them, that their conception of social justice is what they ought to be teaching without regard to other people's points of view. And I think that's always been a very, very serious mistake in education. So along comes the new college, and it has a different mission. Its mission basically is to be a forum for conflicting and diverse points of view, and let the professors and the students have opinions and have perspectives and have ideologies, and let the university essentially be a referee. If not a referee, at least an open forum. The marketplace of ideas, the actual marketplace of ideas. There's a danger. There is a danger, like there is a danger on lawfare, that there would be some, and there are some, and I know there are some, and I know there will be some, who will say to the administration here at New College, why don't you get even? Why don't you become the right-wing conservative analog to what was the bad guy left wing on the other side? That's not the proper answer. There's the temptation, but that's not the proper answer. The proper answer is to go back to the days when teaching was about scholarship, was about learning, was about education, was about neutral principles that could be equally applied. I always talk about the shoe on the other foot test. If you state a principle, it has to be equally applicable. I'll give you an example of the president of Harvard being fired, Claudia Gay. You know that story. She was questioned by another Harvard graduate, Elise Stefanik, who is now back in Congress. And she was asked, under Harvard's rules regulating speech and conduct, is it a violation of Harvard's rules to call for genocide against the Jewish people? Such a simple question. But she couldn't answer it. And she went into all this stuff about it all depends on context. Well, she wouldn't have been fired for that, except that if you were going to be attacking or criticizing any other group, African Americans or gays or transgender people or people of other backgrounds, it wouldn't be a matter of context. You couldn't do it. And so what Harvard was applying was a double standard, and that's what she was fired for, was the overt double standard. She was mispolitically correct. She was the queen of progressive, you couldn't misgender anybody. And so if you have that attitude towards some groups, you can't say it's a matter of context. And I'll just end with one point about how important this is. Look, I'm a lifelong advocate of free speech, and I'm an extremist on free speech. I go further than most other people would in allowing free speech. That doesn't mean that I don't understand the implications of free speech. Yesterday, two brilliant young people who were working at the Israeli embassy went to a Jewish event at the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., and were murdered in cold blood by a man screaming, "Free Palestine." I have absolutely no doubt, as an empirical matter, I'm not talking about the First Amendment now, as an empirical matter, that there is a relationship between this double murder and others that are to come, and there will be some that will be copycatted out of this. There is no doubt in my mind there's a relationship between this and what has been going on college and university campuses with harassment, pushing, shoving, beating people up, holding people in captivity, two janitors who were held in captivity. I have no doubt that there is a relationship. How do I know that? Because I defended a lot of the protesters in the 1960s and the 1970s, the anti-war protesters. And I saw what happened, that people who started by pushing and shoving and breaking windows and doing violent, not free speech protected activities, but violent protests, moved rather easily from that to making bombs, blowing people up, and killing people. And I predicted, I have my 57th book is called The Preventive State, and it's all about preventing crimes and how you predict and how you make sure you don't violate civil liberties. In the book, I actually predicted these two murders. I said that I thought that what's going on campuses today and the toleration of what's going on. By the way, Harvard doesn't only tolerate anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Christianity, anti-Americanism. It doesn't only tolerate it, it teaches it. It teaches it through intersectionality, through DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, through critical race studies, through gender studies, through ethnic studies, through Middle East studies. It actually incites the kind of anti-Semitism that we're seeing. And so I am so honored and thrilled to be part of this family, this new college, this new approach, this attempt to diversify education. And as I will say tomorrow, I predict that when the history of this century is written, New College, your president, those of you who are on the board, students, anybody else, will have an important historical place in having changed and returned colleges all over the country to their fundamental and important purpose of teaching, educating, and research, and not propagandizing. So thank you.
Hey, everybody. Am I the only progressive in the room? I'm just joking. So thank you for that, Alan. I've had the pleasure of having gone to school where Alan was on the faculty for many years at Harvard Law. I was in the same class as Barack Obama and Neil Gorsuch, and I'll get back to why that relates to my story. It's really good to be back in Florida. I'm originally from Jacksonville. Big Florida Gator fan, good year for us, and gonna be a better year next year. Hopefully we'll get the football team in shape now. But in any event, my story, I think, my personal journey as a lawyer very much illustrates sort of some of the problems and challenges with this weaponization of law issue. And I want to briefly summarize what happened to me when I represented communities in the Amazon of Ecuador, indigenous communities and farmer communities, in a pollution battle against a major oil company, first Texaco, now Chevron. Chevron bought Texaco in 2001. When I was a very young lawyer, in my early 30s, I went down to Ecuador as part of an investigative mission, and I traveled around the Amazon and witnessed a horrific situation where there were open cesspools of oil waste dug out of the jungle floor. There were pipes running from many of these pits into rivers and streams that local communities were forced to drink out of. They were basically drinking poisoned water. There was gas flaring without controls. There were oil spills all over the place, and this was not just anywhere. This was in the one of the most pristine, biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. A lot of scientists and others call it the lungs of the planet. This is, excuse me, this is a very important part of life on Earth. It's an important part of the ecosystem. So being that I was a lawyer, and as lawyers are trained to do, we're like, let's do a lawsuit. And we pulled together a group of lawyers, and we filed a lawsuit against first Texaco, and we sued them in New York in federal court in 1993 because they were located, their headquarters at that time were in that jurisdiction. And we basically fought for 10 years to get in the courthouse door and get a trial for our clients. And they fought us every step of the way, insisted the case be heard in Ecuador. They eventually won that battle, but as a condition of moving the case out of New York courts to Ecuador's courts, they had to accept jurisdiction in Ecuador. So there was a silver lining, and by the way, these communities that I was representing had virtually no money. I mean, they really had no money. And just because they had no money didn't mean they had wealth and prosperity, because when you live in the forest that's unpolluted, you have access to wildlife and fish and medicines, natural medicines, and clean water and clean air. The communities had no money, but they did not experience themselves as poor. They actually experienced themselves as very wealthy. and many of them lived to more than 100 years old. I mean, the indigenous groups, when I first got down there, didn't even have a word in their language for cancer. Like, there was no such thing as cancer until the oil development started. And by the way, I'm not against oil development. I'm against pollution, okay? There's a big distinction there. But in any event, there was this massive problem. They insisted the trial be held in Ecuador. We started to litigate the case in Ecuador 10 years into the case. Many people had suffered. Some people had died by that point. And we then had to battle for 10 long years across all sorts of subterfuge and really kind of out there behavior by Chevron. They basically had a strategy, a trial strategy to undermine the trial. I mean, they didn't want the trial to finish. They calculated it would be cheaper to pay a bunch of lawyers to fight us than to pay the people they harmed to clean up the pollution that they caused. So we're battling all this stuff over many, many years. I mean, for example, just to give you one example, in Ecuador, there's a bizarre procedural rule that judges have to rule on any motion file within 3 days. So, yeah, go figure. They would file sometimes 30, 40 motions a day, duplicative on the same topics, few words change here and there, just to sort of grind the court to a halt and force the judges off the case when things were not going well for them. Over the many years of this case, we produced voluminous scientific evidence proving the pollution. We had dozens and dozens of visits to their well sites. It turns out they left about 1,000 open-air toxic waste pits that were gouged out of the floor of the jungle, unlined, that were polluting soils and groundwater, and again, running some of the effluent into rivers and streams that people were drinking out of. So at the time the case finally ended and we won a resounding, and I would argue landmark victory, we have the largest environmental judgment ever won by Amazon communities against an oil company. This happened at the trial level in 2011. It was affirmed unanimously on appeal by Ecuador's Supreme Court in 2013. It was affirmed unanimously on appeal by Ecuador's Constitutional Court. It's a civil law system, so there's two different high courts. That happened in 2018. And they refused to pay the judgment. We started to enforce it in other countries, such as Canada, where Chevron has significant assets. And we won a unanimous Supreme Court decision in Canada in 2015, and it really made Chevron, I think, terrified about the financial risk that they were facing from this case. And not just the financial risk, Alan, I think there was like a psychological component. Like, they couldn't get their arms around the idea that they might have to pay a lot of money to indigenous peoples. They were begging us to figure out a way to pull Ecuador's government into the case so they could negotiate with the government. They had a really hard time, dealing with the idea that these peoples, these vulnerable peoples, could actually go toe-to-toe with them and win a case. In any event, we kept going. They sued me for $60 billion, which is the most amount of money anyone's ever been sued for, on the theory that all my work on this case, all these years, was really part of a fraud. They claimed that the whole case, since they didn't really pollute, or if there was pollution, it wasn't really causing harm, that it was all sham litigation. And ultimately, they got me into court, and this to me is a clear example of how the law can be weaponized. And here I am, a human rights lawyer, went to Harvard Law School, I'm successful in my career, I'm respected, and they went after me with 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers and legal personnel. We know this because in discovery during the RICO case, they had to produce a privilege log, and we counted up the number of lawyers that were listed on that privilege log, like lawyers who have produced documents that they did not want to turn over to us. And I was working with a bunch of other lawyers independently out of my apartment in New York. Okay. I was dealing with some of the most powerful law firms in the United States, working out of my kitchen table, basically. By the way, I wasn't alone. There were a lot of other lawyers working on the case, but we weren't working out of a firm. We were all sort of working in coordinated fashion from various points in the United States and in Ecuador. The upshot is, as we started to gain traction and really get closer to being able to get their assets in other countries like Canada, they went back to Judge Kaplan, who was the judge who helped them orchestrate this RICO case against me. By the way, he's the same judge who oversaw the defamation case of Donald Trump by Jean Carroll over the dressing room incident, same judge. He ended up charging me with criminal contempt of court because I refused an order. I shouldn't say I refused it. I appealed an order that he issued that I turn over my computer, and i.e. my confidential case file, to Chevron's lawyers in the middle of the litigation. I don't know about you, but I've never heard of a civil litigation where a counsel is ordered by a judge to turn over his case file to the other side. So I realized what he was trying to do. I mean, he was trying to basically destroy the case. And he was trying to get me to be disloyal to my clients by turning over this information as a way to save my own butt. You know, he basically tried to put me in a position, you either comply with this order and betray your clients, they would have fired me justifiably, or you don't comply with the order and you're going to jail. That was the position he put me in. And when he charged me with criminal contempt, for refusing to comply with an order that I was appealing at the time he made the charge. I was appealing it to a higher court. In any event, through various maneuvering, he had another judge lock me up on home detention on August 6, 2019. Sorry for being so precise, but I can't get that day out of my mind for obvious reasons. Total shock that I went into court to contest these, what I thought were baseless contempt charges, and the judge locked me up, claiming I was a risk of flight. I'd never missed a court appearance in my entire life. I lived with my wife, and at that time my son was 13 years old in a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. Like, I'm really gonna flee to avoid a misdemeanor criminal contempt case. But it was all just made up as a way to detain me so I couldn't keep going and organizing these legal actions that might result in forcing Chevron to comply with this judgment in Ecuador and thereby save these indigenous groups and farmer communities. So I sort of understand those who say targeted, okay? By the way, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, to be frank. I'm sort of a critic of Donald Trump. But I will say that when I watched what Judge Kaplan did and how he oversaw the case, the defamation case against Donald Trump, I saw a lot of similarities in the technique that this judge used to, I mean, the honest word is to really rig the trial. The judge basically creates a situation where he can reverse engineer the outcome to favor one party over another rather than to do his duty, which is to administer justice in a fair way where both sides have an equal chance and the jury can truly make a decision based on the merits or the evidence presented. You know, it wasn't about that in this court. And Chevron was very effective at working with this judge and using him to really put a judicial imprimatur on what I believe is fundamentally a bunch of dishonest behavior. I mean, as I sit here now, you understand this, I still am under Judge Kaplan's jurisdiction. Like, it's not completely free for me to just sit here and give you my honest opinion, because I live with this I think I'm okay, but I do live with a certain level of latent fear that they could start this whole thing up again, because it was so irregular and so bizarre, and this had never happened to any other lawyer. There's never been a lawyer charged with misdemeanor criminal contempt who's ever been held pre-trial for a minute. And I was held pre-trial with an ankle bracelet for 2 years and 2 months before I could even get a trial on a case with a maximum penalty of 6 months in prison. I served my sentence over 4 times before I went to trial. And when I went to Judge Preska and said, hey, you gotta let me free. Like, I've already served my sentence. I mean, this was Kafkaesque. She's like, no, you're free right now. I'm like, what do you mean I'm free? I'm detained in my house. She said, no, you could be in prison. You could be in jail. I let you go home. That's freedom with conditions. You're free with conditions. But I couldn't leave my house without permission of a probation officer. I didn't go out to dinner for 2.5 years. Couldn't take my family anywhere, like on a vacation. You know, my son is in the prime of his adolescence. And it was a real deprivation of my liberty. And I'll sort of end this part by saying that ultimately, this criminal contempt case, this baseless criminal contempt case. Oh, by the way, I forgot an important point. I was prosecuted by a Chevron law firm. I meant to tell you that, I'm sorry. Very important point. When the judge charged me with criminal contempt of court, the U.S. attorney in the Southern District, Jeffrey Berman at the time, refused to prosecute me. The judge appointed a special prosecutor, a law firm by the name of Seward and Kissel, which is an oil and gas law firm with Chevron as a client, Alan. I got prosecuted in the name of the government by a corporation, okay? And I believe I'm the only person ever in the history of our country to be prosecuted criminally by a corporation. So there was a lot of distasteful things that happened, to say the least. When people talk about weaponization of the law, I mean, I'm a progressive human rights lawyer, but I am a lawyer. I'm a firm believer in the rule of law. I agree with what Alan said about the need to not go overboard, to not have weaponization of the law, to where judges really do their duty and take their duties seriously, unlike the judges who went after me. I really were down with that. But this was really an abomination. It's really unfortunate that it happened. And the worst part, I mean, I'm through it for the most part. Like, we're good. And I'm writing a book about it. But it's my second book, not my 57th. But how do you have time to write 57 books? Man's a genius. But in any event, I just want to say that the communities in Ecuador are still suffering. And the case is not over. And my fervent hope is that other lawyers will rise to the occasion, take the mantle, represent the communities, and enforce this judgment such that Chevron has to comply. And I'll just finally say that the amount of money involved, $10, $12 billion, while it might seem like a lot, is actually not that much compared to the magnitude of the damages, and it's really a pittance relative to what Chevron earns and what Chevron's market value is. If Chevron were to pay the entire judgment, which is unlikely in a settlement, say, it would not have any material impact on the company. No material impact. They can afford this. What they're really scared of, in my opinion, is the model of what this case is. It's the model of like a Harvard law grad, a guy from this world, this privileged legal world, spending a lot of time trying to help people with virtually no money in the Amazon. That model is potentially very dangerous to companies that really go abroad and don't adhere to the same standards they adhere to in this country. And I don't think that the Chevrons of the world, the Exxons of the world want people like me to be able to walk around this earth being the people that actually succeeded in collecting billions of dollars in judgments for indigenous peoples. And I think that showdown, that battle, how that turns out is very, very important to the future of our planet, to the future of the rule of law, and to the future of justice. So thank you.
So, I think this audience would be very interested in some biographical issues. And I want to ask you, why are you a progressive? I want to ask you that question in light of a number of things. Number one, you were victimized by progressive judges, by progressive law firms, by progressive media, etc. And in order to make the question a little fuller, I'm going to give you 2 minutes or 3 minutes of my own autobiography. I called myself a progressive in the sense of Teddy Roosevelt being a progressive back in the beginning of the 20th century. I never called myself a leftist. I was always a classic liberal, and I always thought a classic liberal is very close to a classic conservative in the sense that they both are libertarian. I used to call myself a human rights lawyer. I now despise that term. Human rights has now turned against Israel, the Jewish people, the United States. I'll give you an example. A woman gets on CNN the other day representing transgender women. And she said, if you want to be progressive and you want to support transgender, you have to be opposed to Israel's existence. And so my question really is, progressives have become anti-free speech, anti-tolerant, anti-diversity, except for race, and anti-so many other values that I can understand why you might say you're not a Republican. I'm not a Republican. I left the Democratic Party after the Democratic Convention, but I did not join the Republican Party. I'm an independent. I can see you saying that. I can see you saying that you're a liberal in the classic sense of the word. But don't you acknowledge that progressive has taken on a meaning? The Squad is progressive. Ilhan Omar, who today refused to condemn the murder of the two young people in Washington, she's a progressive. Why are you a progressive?
This is what it was like to be in his class. It's called the Socratic method in action. Let me just say this in response to that question. I'm not a big fan of labels, whether it's progressive, left.
You were
right.
the one who
No,
said
I know.
right.
I'm just trying to situate myself.
Right.
I'm just trying to situate myself with the audience. What I'm really trying to say, what is my philosophy? I mean, I do believe in human rights, and there are the issues that the professor raises about Israel. There's various viewpoints on it. I'm not sure we agree on everything. I get it. I am a person who believes in, creating a more just society across a bunch of different areas, not just the law, but also economic justice and, opportunity for children and sort of a safety net so people aren't starving to death on our streets. I mean, I believe in a lot of different issues. So when I say progressive, what I'm really trying to say is I believe I'm a forward-thinking person who's looking for practical solutions that can make society better. Now, on the free speech question, just on that point, because you're a free speech, person, and you've been a real leader on free speech issues. I actually believe that what happened to me is a free speech issue in the biggest way. I mean, this isn't the First Amendment protects the right to speech, and speech also includes advocacy, right? So when Chevron went after me and Judge Kaplan went after me, to me, they were violating my constitutional rights to exercise my profession and all the training I got to do my job and to help people. And, so a lot of the issues you raise about free speech being attacked, both in the judicial system and in the university context, I get it. I really do. I don't necessarily disagree with that. We might disagree a little bit. I'm sort of coming to grips with these issues. I mean, you actually worked in Harvard for decades, okay? I'm not on a faculty. I'm not in the educational world as a professional. But, I speak a lot at schools. I really do get what you're saying. A lot of this stuff went way, way too far. I'm talking about the DEI stuff. On the other hand, I do believe that we have to recognize that in America, we have had historical injustices, starting with slavery and on, that do still manifest today in many ways, okay? And, what does that mean? What do we do about it? Those are solutions that are probably above my pay grade. But I just want to acknowledge that one of the purposes of the university and the new school, and thank you, by the way, to the board and everyone for inviting me. I mentioned over there, this is really the first institution that's invited me to speak. I've been invited to a bunch of law schools around the country by students. Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the board for inviting me. I appreciate it. But these questions, in the context of learning, in the context of universities, are critical questions. And obviously, there's a lot of thinking going on at the New School and other universities to come to grips with this. And, how that plays out, we'll see how it plays out. But, these are issues with a lot of complexity. And I don't know what I would call myself. Maybe I should stop using the word progressive, but I really do believe justice, fairness, working hard to create a better society where really everyone can be respected.
But I think the key distinction is over the word meritocracy. And you talked about historic injustices and slavery. So I describe myself as a meritocratic libertarian, somebody who deeply believes in meritocracy. I also believe you define meritocracy very broadly. You define meritocracy to include what people have gone through, where people started out, and where they are. But let me make a categorical statement. Race alone is never, ever, under any circumstances, ever relevant to meritocracy. Race alone. And my evidence of that is some of my students I've had at Harvard Law School, black students whose mother was a federal judge, whose father was a hedge fund person, who went to Exeter and Groton and had every conceivable advantage. Yeah, once they went into a store and somebody looked askance at them because they were black and maybe they were going to be, okay, that's fair, but everybody has been through some experiences like that. So my question is, are you prepared to compromise on meritocracy? Once we define meritocracy, once we define it and we figure out what it is, obviously the examples are if you have to have really delicate surgery and you have two people who are potential surgeon, one of whom came from the really difficult situation, whether black or white, whether a fentanyl baby from Appalachia or a heroin baby from Harlem, whether it doesn't matter. But they really started very low and got to this high, really this high. And the other person is a son and daughter of a very wealthy, they went to every school, had every advantage, but their surgical skills are not this high, they're this high. Who would you pick? Everybody in this audience would pick the better surgeon, just like you would pick the better pilot, just like you would pick the better stock picker and stock broker. So we're all meritocratic in some areas, but we're not meritocratic in other areas. And so my question to you is, whether you're progressive or not, I agree with you, labels don't matter, but I do think where you stand on meritocracy tells us a lot about what your political philosophy is. So would you share with us what you think your view is on meritocracy?
Me?
Yeah, I'm supposed to ask you questions. That's my job.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Your job is to ask me questions. You get to ask me the next question. Okay.
I believe in meritocracy. Totally. It depends, obviously, how you define it. I think that's where the sort of the differences come in. Look, when I went down to Ecuador, just to sort of bring it back to my own experience, I had graduated from Harvard, and I'm going to sort of illustrate sort of a little bit about meritocracy from the perspective of this case. When you go to Harvard Law, they train you to lead the world. I mean, let's just be frank. You are going to be a leader. Barack Obama in my class became president. Neil Gorsuch became a Supreme Court justice. Ted Cruz, not in my class, became a senator. I mean, and this is not just Harvard, obviously. It's a lot of institutions in this world, including the New School, which obviously has a lot of leaders all over the place at this point. So when I went down to Ecuador, I went down with the idea that I was going to teach the communities how they could help themselves, how they could do a lawsuit, how they could get a remedy from Chevron. I was going to help save them. I had a bit of a savior complex. That's how I was trained. And I went down expecting to teach them, and I tell you, over the many years of trial and error, and I took over 250 trips to the Amazon, I'm proud to say that I ended up learning a lot more from them than they ever learned from me. I mean, it's extraordinary. And these are people with no formal education and no money. And how can that be? How the hell can that be? And the way that can be is when you go into the jungle and you understand the relationship of indigenous peoples to the forest and to nature and to the need to protect our world and our humanity. We're up here in a very, no disrespect, but we live in a very consumerist society. people go into the workforce. I need to make a living. I'd like to accumulate enough money so I can live with security and retire someday. That's it. Down in Ecuador, in the Amazon.
What does that word mean?
You don't know how to retire.
I never heard of it.
I'm with you on that.
I never heard it.
He's written 57. He's going to write another 57 before it's all over. But, it's a different kind of approach to living that I think has a ton of lessons for those of us who sort of think we know what meritocracy is. I mean, no disrespect. I'm just saying there's lots of elements out there that we can learn from as we sort of fill out what the definition of meritocracy is. Because, I was just in D.C. with a community leader from Ecuador on Monday and Tuesday of this week. And this guy, his name is Donald Moncayo, he was amazing, telling the story of his people to members of Congress and senators. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, okay, yeah, I have a more formal education. I know a lot more about the law. But holy Moses, watching him do his thing, I don't feel like I have anything over him. So when we talk about diversity, and we talk about meritocracy, I do think we need to not get overly caught up in this race stuff that is going on in this country, and really look at people for who they are and for the beauty they bring to this world, or for the experiences they bring to this world, and not just assume, that success is defined by how much money you have, or happiness is defined by where you stand in life. You can be, I learned, I never understood.
I agree.
You can be happy with no money in the Amazon, assuming there's no pollution. Now, if I gave any of you a choice, you want to do what you're doing, I know you probably wouldn't go, but they wouldn't come here.
Yep.
They wouldn't trade their position for what you have. So we need to be very respectful of people and very open-minded about how we define these issues.
I agree completely. All right, you get to ask me a question now.
So you've been battling all sorts of interesting cases for decades, on the First Amendment. When you sort of look at the whole history of your work from the beginning, I think you said you started teaching in 1964?
Right.
Okay.
I was 25 years old, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you see the evolution of the First Amendment over all those decades? Is it stronger now? Is it weaker? Does it ebb and flow? Was there a period of time, during your career where it was stronger than it is now, or even much stronger? Was there a kind of a golden age of the First Amendment that we no longer? Give us a sense of what you've witnessed over all these decades in terms of the First Amendment.
I have discovered that very, very, very few people, no matter what their politics, really, really believe in the full, free, and open marketplace of ideas that underlies the First Amendment. The vast majority of people believe in free speech for me, but not for thee. Mm-hmm. They are brilliantly able to concoct arguments. It started with the dumbest statement ever made by a smart person, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, nobody has the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. The dumbest thing a judge ever said. Why? Shouting fire falsely in a crowded theater is not speech. It's pulling an alarm. Mm-hmm. Remember, we have this congressman, thank God, a former congressman from New York, who pulled the alarm. Would the case have been different if instead of pulling the alarm, say he tried to pull the alarm and it didn't work, and so he yelled, fire, fire? It's exactly the same case. So what case did that horrible expression grow out of? It grew out of a bunch of people who were lining up to volunteer to fight in the First World War. They were being drafted, rather, into the First World War. And a socialist handed out leaflets to everybody in line saying, I don't want you to violate the law. I don't want any of you to break the law. I want you all to know, here's the text of the statute that gives you the right not to be drafted if you're a conscientious objector. Read it. And if you are a conscientious objector, we urge you not to fight Wall Street's war. That's what the pamphlet said. What does that have to do with shouting fire in a crowded theater? That's like somebody handing out a leaflet in front of a crowded theater saying, don't go into that theater. It hasn't been inspected for fire in a long time. and there's a possibility maybe that you'll be risking your life by going in. So we figured out every conceivable way to cut out what really constitutes free speech. And almost nobody wants their enemies to have free speech. So I condemn the progressives for many of them calling for the end of free speech. By the way, that's being taught now in universities and law schools around the country, that free speech is a patriarchal, colonialist way of giving white power to people because they're more articulate, and we shouldn't believe in free speech. So the struggle for free speech never stays won. It's an ongoing struggle. You always have to do it. And you're absolutely right. Free speech comes up in a variety of contexts. It comes up in the context of you being absolutely muzzled, and you still are 1% muzzled. Fortunately, you have the courage that you're willing to take a chance, but you feel muzzled. And many people feel muzzled. So I think that we're not in a good place when it comes to free speech. Another example of free speech in practice. I've now been retired from Harvard 11 years. I was one of the most popular speakers on the Harvard campus. I would get 1,000 people. I debated William Buckley. I debated everybody on the Harvard campus. I would speak there at least once a month. Since the issues relating to Israel came out, and since I defended Donald Trump, and since I was falsely accused of Jeffrey Epstein-related matters, I have not been invited a single time back to Harvard. That I can speak all over. I can be on television tonight. It means that the students of Harvard have been denied my voice. They haven't heard my voice, and they won't allow me to speak there. One student group, Chabad, invited me, and it had to be moved off campus for fear of my life that I wouldn't be allowed to speak at Harvard. Students at Harvard tell me every day they are free speech, but they are terrified to speak out and exercise the free speech because they'll be ostracized, they'll be humiliated, they'll be attacked. So I would say that I've been fighting for free speech since I would say I was a high school student. But in college, I had debates with an interesting man. His name was Eugene Scalia. He had an interesting son, went on the Supreme Court. Eugene Scalia was a very conservative professor at Brooklyn College, and he believed that communists shouldn't be allowed to teach at Brooklyn College, and he ended up being instrumental in the firing of a guy named Slockower. Went up to the Supreme Court. I was the president of the student government at Brooklyn College, and I was the strong advocate of free speech. And the president of Brooklyn College wouldn't write me a recommendation to law school, even though I was first in my class at Brooklyn College, because I was too much of a free speech activist. So I've been a free speech activist for, it's close to 70 years. And I do think that I would have to say that today, free speech in practice, is probably at its lowest point in my experience.
Wow.
Yeah, its lowest point. FIRE, this organization, that, the ACLU no longer believes in free speech. The ACLU is now the Anti-Civil Liberties Organization. It only free speech for me, but not for thee. But FIRE is a very good organization. It ranks colleges. Guess which college ranked last for free speech of every single college and university in the United States? Harvard. And I don't know what your ranking was, but I'm sure it was very good. And other schools have been very good as well. But when it comes to actual feeling that you're free to express views, I think we're at our lowest point.
In the course of your career, when do you think we were at our best? And I know there's always a threat, and we're never where we need to be. But when was like the better years?
I think during the late 60s and 70s, the free speech movement, the protests against the Vietnam War, some of which were violent, and some of which led to continuing violence. But I think people felt, look, I'm going to go so far as to say the Lincoln-Douglas debates could not be held at Harvard today. They could be held at New College, but they couldn't be held at Harvard. Half the school would say, we're not interested in hearing Lincoln. Half the school would say, we're not interested in hearing Douglas. People are just not interested in hearing other points of view. When I used to debate Bill Buckley, there were crowds around the block wanting to listen, and half of them were Buckley supporters, and half of them were my supporters. And at the end, Bill and I went out for a drink. And at the end, I would say to him, Bill, you know, you changed my mind on a few things. Mm-hmm. And he would say, well, Alan, you never changed my mind, but you made me at least think hard about it. So, I think there's never been a golden time,
Right.
but maybe a little bit of a silver time for free speech in the 60s and 70s.
Can I ask you another
Sure,
quick
please.
question?
No, keep going.
So in my world, the progressive world, there's sort of I would say, somewhat of a consensus opinion that the administration of Donald Trump is sort of moving into an authoritarian governing model in this country. And my question to you is, and which some people in my world believe undermines democracy.
Yeah.
My question to you is, what's your view of that? Like, do you think that there are some things where the Trump administration is going too far and not abiding by court orders, for example, the moving of the immigrants down to the prison in El Salvador without due process, those kinds of issues? Are you bothered by any of that? And what's your assessment of that whole issue?
Oh, I'm very, very bothered by it, and I've been publicly critical about it. There are people within the Trump administration and also people outside the Trump administration who have Trump's ears, who are authoritarian by nature and would like to see the government move in a more authoritarian way. But we are not in a constitutional crisis. Let me explain why. So far, with the one exception you pointed out, where the Supreme Court mistakenly, it didn't understand the record in the case, it made a terrible mistake, mistakenly said that the person from Maryland had to be brought back to the United States and the administration had to facilitate it. There was never an order that he has to be in the United States. The order of the courts were that he can be deported. He just couldn't be deported to El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, but he could be deported. And so that was a mistake. The Supreme Court should have ordered that the president has to facilitate him getting some kind of a due process hearing. Now, you can get a due process hearing by Zoom. We've all argued cases by Zoom. You can get it out of the country and in the country. I think there are people within the Trump administration, like many administrations, that are trying to push the administration toward authoritarianism. There are others in the administration that are pushing equally hard in the opposite direction. I'll give you an example. Your former senator, Senator Rubio, Secretary of State Rubio, is very much a force against authoritarianism and a force that I think will want very hard to keep the other forces in check. There's a lot of dispute within the administration, and of course, Trump listens to everybody. Often agrees with the last person he spoke to, so it's really important to get to him last. But he really listens, but there are dangers. But we're not in a crisis. We've had 2 constitutional crises in our history. One was when Andrew Jackson told the Chief Justice in the Native American case involving North Carolina, you rendered the decision, now you go enforce it. And of course, courts can't enforce their decisions. They need the executive branch to enforce it. That and the Dred Scott decision, which led to the Civil War. Those were cases in which the courts couldn't resolve conflicts. We're in a constitutional conflict, serious one, because Trump himself, now I don't think Trump is an authoritarian, but I think he is pressing the envelope. He is pushing it harder than any president probably since, and the only other 3 presidents who have pressed it as hard as he is happen to be 3 of our greatest presidents, and that's Jefferson, Lincoln. Jefferson, of course, bought Louisiana without any congressional approval. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt probably posed the greatest constitutional crisis in modern history by threatening to pack the court, and he got the justices to change their view. It's called the switch in time that saved 9. And then he put 110,000 loyal Americans of Japanese descent into detention centers. That was a constitutional disaster. I'm on my guard. And President Trump knows that he does not have an ally in me if he moves too far in the direction of being anti-democratic. But, you know, it's hard to say somebody is not democratic when they have won both houses of Congress, won the majority of the popular vote, won the electoral vote, and has poll numbers that are still pretty good. You can say that he has done things that pose dangers to democracy. And I'm on guard for that because the American Civil Liberties Union is not on guard for that. The American Civil Liberties Union is on guard to make sure that Trump doesn't benefit from anything like that. But today we don't have a true, neutral civil liberties watchdog the way we ought to. So I am worried, I am concerned, and President Trump, you know, I think I've told you, I'm not going to tell anybody who I voted for. In the last election, I voted against Trump in 16 and against him in 20. But as Trump has said to a crowd of people, Dershowitz is not going to tell us who he voted for because he really likes sleeping with his wife. And I do. And so you're not going to know who I voted for in the last election. But I am, I do support Trump's fight against politicization of the judiciary, and I am opposed to some of his things. On the issue of Harvard, that's very complicated. I'm writing a new book, right, 58, and it has a pretty provocative title, Trump to Harvard, Go Fund Yourself.
That's a good title.
It's a good title. It's a good title. And
how do you feel about the funding issue?
Well, that's what I want to talk about. So I don't want to take too much of the time. I don't want to monopolize, but let me give you one instance. So I went to college in 1955, and I vividly remember what was going on because I was very active. As I said, president of student government, I'd been very active. A year before the Supreme Court rendered the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that said, University of Alabama, University of Mississippi, University of South Carolina, you all have to integrate. You must integrate. And what was happening in 1955? The Klan was going on college campuses, wearing masks, and intimidating black students, the very few of them. Professors were teaching white supremacy in the classroom. Universities were intimidating black students. We, as liberals, may have even called myself a progressive back then, but I'm sure you share this view, we would have been thrilled if the federal government had withheld financing, tax exemption from these colleges that were violating Title VI and the Constitution. So there is nothing wrong in principle, with the federal government putting a thumb on the scale of financing. Now, legally, of course, no school has the right to federal funding, obviously. It's a matter of discretion. They can't have their funding denied based on race or religion. Religion, perhaps, the Supreme Court 4-4 decided today, I think, or yesterday, that Catholic charter schools don't necessarily have a constitutional right to get funding. These are complicated and interesting issues. And so I think the administration has gone too far. I don't think there should be any cutting off of funding for cancer research, for Alzheimer's research, for child illness research. I'm in favor of targeted defunding. I want to see no money going to the Harvard Divinity School, which has become a cesspool. And the tragedy is it's a cesspool in the name of Christianity. It's horrible. It's become the most anti-Semitic school. Don't believe me. This is not something I said. I didn't even know it. I read this in the Harvard report. Harvard did a report on its own schools, and it said the two schools that are the most supportive of anti-Semitism are the School of Public Health and the Divinity School, both of which are very progressive. And so I'm in favor of targeted defunding, but not defunding that applies to pure scientific research.
Do we want to maybe...
Thank you.
Lest this
Great
become
questions.
a debate. Yeah, thank you, Alan.
No, these are great questions. If every progressive was like him, maybe I'd become a progressive too. But
So now we'll take questions from the audience. I just want to remind everybody our question's about 30 seconds long. It's not, this is time to hear them. So we can probably get 10, 15 questions if you keep it really short. And I don't want to be rude, but I will cut you off if you don't. But any questions from the audience? Bruce. Can you guys hear him in the back?
Bruce. Excuse me.
We have a structural problem with the judiciary in this country that goes from very low level all the way to high profile things like what you described and what we're seeing with nationwide injunctions. And that is that a trial judge can make any ruling on any issue for any reason. And it's the law until it's appealed. And that same trial judge can also control how long it'll take before it gets appealed. And if it's eventually appealed and overturned, there is no functional penalty to the trial judge for having done that. How do you fix a system that's got that type of incentive system built in at the structural level?
you're absolutely right. Should I?
First of all, I love the question.
Yeah, me
I think
too.
you're
Yeah.
totally right. That's a super interesting policy question, but I'm interested to hear what Alan has to say about that.
Well, I think there's a legislative solution to it. In fact, I'm just drafting an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal about it. I think that Congress should create a new court, much like the FISA court. FISA court is a court that deals with national security issues. 5 judges, 7 judges, picked from around the country, either picked by the Chief Justice or, if you don't like that, by the Judicial Conference. And if you want to make a nationwide injunction, you have to go to that court. That court can then issue nationwide injunctions that are immediately appealable to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court decides the case. But individual judges have no authority to issue nationwide injunctions. And I think it'd be workable, and I think it would also reduce the number of nationwide injunctions that were being sought. Look, our Constitution, Article 3 of the Constitution, this was argued the other day in the Supreme Court, provides for limited jurisdiction by the judiciary. And the limited jurisdiction is to cases and controversies involving people who have standing and who should be affected by the outcome of the case. And so the idea that a single judge in Massachusetts can bind Florida and vice versa it makes no sense at all. And so I think that problem could be solved legislatively. By the way, while I'm on that problem, the other thing that could be solved legislatively is birthright citizenship. Remember, the Constitution says if you're born in the United States, and they meant to slaves, obviously, but if you're born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction, you are a citizen. Congress can decide who's subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. It can decide to take an easy case that if a person is born to 2 illegal aliens, or even legal aliens that are in the country, just come for a visit as a student, are here for a month, have a baby, and then go back, Congress can say that baby is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, it becomes a lot more complicated when the people have lived here for a particular period of time, even if they're illegal. But I think Congress has been sitting on its hands and has not been helping the president with many of these constitutional issues, which I think Congress could help resolve and make it easier. What do you think?
Well, look, I think the idea of a FISA-type court for nationwide injunctions is intriguing. I think the question, though, goes beyond that. I think the question really is how trial judges in sort of run-of-the-mill cases have enormous power to screw parties, and they can do it by not moving the case. I mean, they can just sit on a case. I've got a case in the Chevron case in San Francisco. It was 2012. We were seeking an order for discovery against something, and the judge still hasn't ruled on it. And it's obviously never going to rule on it. I mean, trial judges have enormous power to shape cases, to deny justice to parties. And sometimes it's just lassitude. I just think a lot of judges feel overwhelmed by their caseloads, or they don't work that hard. I mean, not all judges really like working. And let me say,
Some do.
some do.
Yeah.
Judge Kaplan works really hard. But I'll tell you, the quality control of judges. Look, it's much more exciting to have a career, in my opinion, like Alan or a really top-level litigator than to sit on a bench, unless you're obviously at the Supreme Court or a high-level judge. But like a lot of trial judges, that work, attracts, people who, I don't know. I think a lot of the best lawyers don't want to be judges. Would you agree with that?
I agree, yeah.
So you're getting us into a situation where, a lot of trial judges just aren't moving stuff and they're determining outcomes of cases through their procedural lassitude or some other discretionary authority they have. And these cases can languish for years and years and years, and justice is denied. I don't know the solution to that problem.
When I was 35 years old, Ted Kennedy called me and asked me if I wanted to be a federal district court judge.
I'm sure you said no in 5 minutes.
No, I had to spend the whole night thinking about it because I knew how my mother would have liked it. And I didn't call my mother. If I had been married to Carolyn, I would have called her and she would have said, don't do it. I slept on it all night and I called Kennedy the next day. And I said, no, I was born to be a ball player, not an umpire. Yeah. And so I would do that. Let me tell you one story about a judge which you won't believe, and you'll have to check it out and you'll see I'm telling you the truth. There was a judge, I forget, North Carolina, somewhere in that area, who had a very good friend. And the friend came to him one day at home, not even in his chambers, and said, I have a real problem. My 16-year-old daughter is going out with this ne'er-do-well, and he's going to impregnate her. It's going to ruin her life. And so what I want to do is have her tubes tied so she can't have any babies, but she won't agree to that. So what I need you to do, Your Honor, is sign a statement agreeing to have her have an appendix operation. She doesn't need an appendix operation, but sign that, and then we'll have her tubes tied. And that happened. She then, wait a second, she then gets married to a different guy, a good guy, nice guy. She can't have a baby. She doesn't know why. Finally, after a few years, she goes to the doctor. The doctor says, you've had your tubes tied. And she finds out what happened. They go to court, and the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court, rules this judge has judicial immunity. So talk about being above the law. This is like the judge who recently allowed somebody to sneak out of her courtroom to the back door. They're not acting as judges when you sign a statement allowing, an innocent girl to be denied the right to have children. But courts are so willing to give credibility to judges. So yeah, nobody's above the law except judges. And I think many judges really are today.
There's no real effective way to remove a federal judge other than impeachment. And I think only 4 of all the federal trial judges since the inception of this country, I think only 4 have been removed.
So I think the courts have been misinterpreting the impeachment clause. Look, the one part of the Constitution that I am really an expert on is the impeachment clause. Of course, I represented President Trump in impeachment. I believe that federal judges can be removed without being impeached. Why? First of all, they are the only people in the Constitution whose tenure is defined by good behavior. And good behavior is not the criteria for impeachment. You can't impeach a president for bad behavior. That's why I defended Trump. You can impeach him. They say he, abused justice and defied Congress. It has to be treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. What if you have a federal judge, and there have been some, I argued in front of one, who is senile, who has Alzheimer's, who is drunk every day, who is having sex with his law clerks and his secretaries, none of which are criminal, and you have to be able to get rid of a judge like that. And what they do today is they have an informal process where a group of judges go to see the old judge and say, it's about time. I argued a case in front of Judge Lombard. I'm going to name names. I don't care about that. I argued a case in front of Judge Lombard, who was the chief judge of the Second Circuit. And I'm making my argument. He's asking me these really dumb questions that had nothing to do with my case. Finally, one of the judges whispered in his ear that he was reading the wrong briefs. He was asking me about a case that I had nothing to do with. Now, that person should not be sitting on the bench. So there have to be mechanisms for removing judges. There should also be mechanisms for removing judges who were just nasty and impossible and difficult. And we all know people like that. They have no right to be judges. A judge, a robe doesn't give you the right to abuse citizens.
Do you have, Crystal, have a question? Yeah.
And we have to start. There's some women in the back. who
Okay,
want to
I'll
ask
head
questions.
back
Yeah,
there.
good.
I was just curious, Mr. Donziger, if you could elaborate the more to the story of when you were in class with Gorsuch and Obama.
And it sounded like it was tied into your case somehow.
Well, this is interesting. So, Justice Gorsuch, I never knew. I don't think I said one word to him. There were 550 people in our law school
Yeah.
class, and it was possible to go 3 years and not meet a lot of people. So I never had one word with him. There's an interesting story about him, though, as it relates to the Chevron case, which I'll tell in a second. Barack Obama, I was friends with. We played a lot of basketball together. The law school had like a gym.
Hemingway.
Hemingway.
I played up there,
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
We
yeah.
called it the highest court in the land. Yeah.
That's good. We played a lot of basketball. We were friends. I mean, we weren't like close friends. Two stories about.
He had a good running slight hook shot off the backboard. I played against him once also. He was very good.
He's good. He's good. You know, he sort of had a suburban shooting style. He didn't like to mix it up too much, but I always liked him. I thought he was a superstar in law school, and he you know, whatever you think of his presidency, you would agree at Harvard he was extremely highly regarded, and he was just a good guy. But this is the funny part. You know, I don't think many people know this, but when he got out of law school, he became a state legislator in Illinois. And he eventually ran for Congress, I think in an open seat, and he lost. And he had met Michelle, and you know, she was like the main earner in the family. And he
She
wanted
was a student at Harvard Law School, too.
Yeah,
I knew her as
she was
well.
also
Yeah.
at Harvard. And he wanted to run for Senate in this open seat. And he tells this story that she told him, like, this is your last race. If you don't win this one, you're going to work at a law firm. You're going to make some real money, okay? And there was an open seat, bunch of candidates. He prevailed.
But you know how he prevailed. He was running in the primary against, now somebody will know more than I do. I think the guy's name was King. Was it? Yeah, and he got into an adultery problem.
Yeah.
Right, and he had to back away.
Yeah.
And he was favored to win. And once he had to get out of, yeah.
In any event, he got elected to the Senate. At that time, Chevron was lobbying the Bush administration, which was in power, to cut trade ties to Ecuador to punish the government for letting their own citizens do our case in their own court system, because Chevron plays hardball, okay? And I went to Obama. He had just been elected Senate, and I said, hey, is there a way you could write a letter to the U.S. Trade Representative telling him to just stay out of it? Don't do anything, just stay out of this. Let the trade preferences keep going. And he ended up writing a letter, and he got Pat Leahy to sign it with him. And it really helped the case a lot, and I always appreciated that because, you know, I was nobody. I was like a lawyer on this really kind of bizarre case out of Ecuador. I mean, he knew me from law school, but he didn't have to do that. So I appreciate that he did that. As for Gorsuch, this is actually quite interesting. So remember I told you I got detained for almost 3 years. That case, Steve Vladeck was my lawyer, went up on appeal, a petition of certiorari to the Supreme Court. And I got a bunch of Federalist Society lawyers to represent me because they were so offended. This is quite interesting, by my private corporate prosecution as a violation of the Constitution, the Appointments Clause. So I had this team of lawyers, like I had Zuckerman, Spader, like these liberal lawyers. I had this appellate litigation firm that was full of like former justice clerks for like Scalia, John Roberts, all representing me together. I couldn't have been.
Was this Cooper and Kirk?
No, it was Shearer.
Okay,
Yeah. I couldn't have been better represented, you know. And they basically repositioned me from the progressive lawyer to like this guy who just got completely screwed. It got up, the Supreme Court justices met 5 different times. They kept putting this off. There was clearly some agonizing internal debate over whether to grant certiorari to my criminal conviction. I actually believe had they granted it, it would have been overturned at least 7-2,
without
if
a
not
doubt,
9-0.
yeah.
I mean, it was just so
Without a
ridiculous. But the question is, how do they want to expend their limited resources? The case really wasn't that important, I think, in some of their eyes. But this is the upshot. Even though they denied cert, I got a very good dissent, written by Neil Gorsuch. Is that crazy? And it's 5 pages. I couldn't have written any better myself. And in this dissent, he says, the Constitution does not tolerate what happened here.
Yeah, yeah,
Good for him.
yeah, no, I
Okay?
agree.
That's my classmate. Never said one word to the guy.
Any other questions in the back? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, I didn't see it. Hey, Michelle, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
An alumni.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Dershowitz, you said that the First Amendment, and I'm going to paraphrase, is on its sickbed right now. How did it get there? How did it get sick? And what is the antidote?
Okay, it's a great question. Look, the First Amendment was dead until 1920. We didn't have a First Amendment until 1920. Remember the history. You get an amendment written in, I think, 1793, and it says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. What happened 6 years later? They passed the Alien and Sedition Act, which is a law imprisoning newspapers for criticizing the government. I mean, what could be more hypocritical than that? Then you go 100 years or more than 100 years, and you get no First Amendment cases to speak of, none. And then Brandeis invents the First Amendment, essentially. He brings along the stodgy old guy named Holmes, and the two of them really invent the First Amendment. And they...
I do social media, by the way. I just have to get my little picture.
I have never made it on my photogenic or my looks, but I'm really happy. And so Brandeis really enlivened the First Amendment. And then it was always selectively used. But it had, from the 1920s, when Holmes and Brandeis, they lost. People forget that most of the important First Amendment decisions were minority decisions, were dissenting decisions. And then they became majority decisions when I was a law clerk. I was a law clerk in 1962, 63, and that was the Warren Court. And we had just phenomenal First Amendment cases in which we really redefined the First Amendment. And so I think from the 60s, and it was non-political. I mean, you couldn't tell whether a person who was voting on the right side of the First Amendment was a conservative or a liberal. You got Black, who was very, very liberal. Then you got Harlan, who was very, very conservative, writing great First Amendment. I mean, Harlan, this man who has never, ever even heard the F word, ever heard of it. This guy was brought up with silk pillows and, everything was, I had to go to his house once to get him to sign off on a decision saving a person's life from execution. 9 o'clock at night, I walk in. He and his wife are having dinner at a long table. He's wearing a tuxedo. This is just the two of them. She's wearing a dress down her knees, and then I asked. He said, "I can't sign anything now. I'm having my dinner, but come into the area afterward, and we'll have a brandy and a cigar." So I had never smoked a cigar, but I went and had a brandy and a cigar, and he signed it. A guy walks into court one day during the Civil Rights Movement. His name is Cohen. Walks into court, and he has a jacket on, and it says F, but it spells out the entire word, the draft, and he gets convicted and prosecuted. The case comes to the Supreme Court, and Harlan, who couldn't even pronounce the word. I have to tell you one more thing about it. So I was in the courtroom when the case was argued, and the Chief Justice, Berger, sends a letter to the lawyers saying, we all know what the word is. Do not say it in court. Do not say it in court, because it will demean the dignity of the Supreme Court. Do not say it in court. So the lawyer for the Cohens gets up and says, Mr. Chief Justice, may it please the court. He looks at Berger and he says, fuck the draft, or fuck the court, whatever it is. And he says, have the pillars crumbled? Has the nation fallen? And everything is the same. And Harlan writes this opinion, which he doesn't mention the word, but he says, one man's obscenity is another man's lyric. And he writes, this brilliant First Amendment case. So, those were the days when it wasn't a liberal conservative issue, when you couldn't tell whether or not a justice was appointed by a Republican or a Democrat. Brennan was appointed by Eisenhower. Those days, I'm afraid, are gone forever.
I think we have time for one more question, then we'll do some closing remarks. Anybody? Yes, sir.
By the way, great questions from the audience, really good questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. By the way, I'm Henry Tenenbaum, no longer the Nudnik. It's good to see you. Thank you
Nice
for
to
all
see you.
you've done.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Still a Nudnik, huh?
Yeah, no, you're the guy who God invented erase the email. What's that term they use? Delete.
Delete.
Yeah, I call you Mr.
that's
Delete,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, because you didn't respond to my going to Chinese dinner tonight either.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't mean
That's
to
all right.
insult you. Good.
God, there's so much. Thank you, you two. You've been brilliant, both of you. I could listen to you guys continuously. That's brilliant. What a pleasure. My question is, I'm sure you all heard about Supreme Court Sotomayor's comment at the American Bar Association. And I was just wondering what your reaction to that is, especially since in the context of lawfare. Thank you.
What did she say? I'm not familiar with it.
Well, she's made a few comments. Which one are you referring to
To
specifically?
this last one where she told the American Bar Association to stand up and fight back.
Yeah, no, I agree, yeah. Look, the bar associations have become partisan in many ways, and almost all bar associations are very anti-Trump. And justices shouldn't be making partisan political statements. It's happened for many years. Ruth Bader Ginsburg made very strong partisan statements.
Sam Alito.
Alito has made strong partisan statements. You're absolutely right. That's why people like us don't become judges, because we want to make partisan statements.
It's more fun making partisan statements.
But if you're a judge, you just can't. The Justice Harlan, who I loved, I got to know him when I was a law clerk, but he was a marvelous man. He couldn't be two different people than me and Justice Harlan. But once he became a judge, he never voted. He said he didn't want in any way to be even psychologically influenced. He said, I am now out of politics. And that's the way it should be.
With that, we'll do closing remarks by both of them. We're going to put on the screen a barcode, so if you want to support the Socratic stage or get information or make sure you're on the mailing list for future events, we'll put that up on the screen, take a picture of it, and you can have it. And then after their closing remarks, they both are kindly going to be available down front for maybe 15 minutes before they have to leave to talk and shake some hands. Thank you very much.
Do you want to start? Okay.
Well, I don't really have much more to say other than to thank you, really, for inviting me. I really enjoyed being here, and it's not over yet. Alan, it's great to share this dialogue
likewise.
with you. I mean, we don't agree on everything, but, wow, I followed your career since I was a little kid. Actually, I think you're one of the reasons I became a lawyer. Not the only reason, but like watching you on TV when I was young. It's like, wow, that's like what an advocate is. And even though, things have evolved to where we probably disagree on a ton of stuff, I think on the fundamentals, on freedom, on free speech, and on the need to really treat everyone with respect and to really rein in the excesses of the weaponization of the law, I think we have a wide broad agreement on that. And I'll just end by saying, you know, when we think about weaponization of the law, just to sort of get back to the topic, it's not just the government, it's private corporations that do it too. And there's a lot of big law firms that make a ton of money being hired to go after people. I mean, it happened to me, to silence their free speech rights. And I think it's very important that people understand, like, if you read about a case, like you read about this guy, and this happened to me, you know, oh my God, a judge found he, in a civil case without a jury, committed a fraud in Ecuador. You probably know this better than most, but don't believe necessarily everything judges say and decide.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
There are other stories behind that, and there is a lot of weaponization going on. And because of the good graces of a lot of people, I mean, I don't know how many people before tonight knew about my situation, but, you know, I put up a website when I got arrested. I had no money to defend myself. I needed to raise money through a legal defense fund. And I got my story out there, and I make jokes. I during COVID and when I was detained, I would talk to anyone who invited me, including a kindergarten class even, okay? Because I was like, you gotta defend yourself. And ultimately, over several years, 4 years, I've had 51,000 different individuals from around the world donate to my defense fund. Most are very small donations, which I love, okay? But when you put it out there, when you're, you know, being attacked, and you put it out there and you stand up, I find that people, regardless of their politics, whether they're Republican, Democrat, or whatever, progressive, or whatever you want to call yourself, people respond to injustice.
Yeah.
And I salute all of you. I know that's why you're here tonight. You all care to some degree. Who knows all the different wonderful things you folks are involved in. But I'm just telling you, it's really good to be in this community, even for a day. Thank you for what you do. Keep fighting, and, you know, let's all fight for a better world, even if we disagree along the way.
This is one of the only colleges at which this event could take place. It could not take place at Harvard. It could not take place at Yale. It could not take place at Columbia. You don't realize how fortunate you are to live in a community where free speech, the First Amendment, due process is all alive and well. And thank God for New College, because it's found an absolutely important niche. It's going to be criticized, and sometimes it may be justly criticized, but it is an important player and an important part of our academic marketplace of ideas. This is going to sound like a strange statement. The United States could survive today without Harvard. The United States could not survive today without New College.